Jwanah, first and foremost, thank you for taking time to do this with me. It's a privilege because this is a topic that I know very little about, and it's been a few weeks now that I knew we were going to do this, and then COVID-19 kind of changed everything, and you told me that you were out of town in South Carolina, and I decided to stick to New York, and I think you're lucky in a sense. You got to get out while you could. And we're doing this on Skype video. It speaks to the moment that we can't do this in person. But I feel very lucky because as a sort of a fellow passionate urban planning enthusiast, whatever you want to call it, this sort of love of old things, mostly buildings and cities. It's always a treat to speak to somebody with this kind of flaw, this very severe character flaw, which I find endearing. First and foremost, how have the last few weeks been for you? Away from urban planning, away from Aleppo, away from all that we're going to discuss. How has it been just being sort of in South Carolina, at home, fairly isolated and social distancing? How has it impacted you?
Honestly, being social distancing in South Carolina is very different from social distancing in New York because as always, the rest of America is very different than the city of New York because over there you have space, you have cars, you just get in a car, you go 20 miles. Whereas in New York, if you leave the house, you're immediately at risk of coming into contact with the virus in some way.
Right.
So actually, when I was in South Carolina with my sister, I didn't feel isolated at all because we could still get in the car, go to the store, wait in line. They had lines outside stores, and the weather is nice, so you can wait outside. Go into a store, interact with people. Whereas here, every time my roommates and I go outside, people are stepping away from each other in a narrow sidewalk.
Right.
If you go into a store, it's a lot more cramped than a store outside of New York. So it speaks a lot, actually, to urban planning, even without intending on it.
Oh, that's interesting. Right. So the way it's just the way South Carolina is that you are going to be distant by default. You're not going to be. Right.
And I was in Charleston. I wasn't in, rural South Carolina. It's just a city built around a car as opposed to a city built around pedestrians like New York. And so it's just drastically different.
Yeah. No, I agree. I didn't think about the urban planning factor. That's actually quite interesting. So in a way, coming back to New York probably feels very shocking given that, it's almost like the South Carolina lifestyle, but in the city, that it sort of feels unnatural.
It really does, and I think I might repeat this several times in this talk that we're going to have. New York reminds me a lot of Halab, of Aleppo. It's very crowded, it's big, it's loud, it's dirty, it's bustling. And so coming back to New York during the COVID, the first thing that struck me was how the city is completely empty. I'm seeing streets and not even at this point paying much attention because there's no cars, there's nobody in the streets. And of course, it's making me think this is exactly what Halab must be like right now. Because, and then additionally, I'm speaking to my friends and my family there, and they're just too afraid to leave the house because if they get this, there is no hospital with a ventilator that can take care of them. Right. So it's whatever is going on here for me kind of feels kind of like home, except home is tenfold amplified.
That's really interesting. So you've been in touch regularly with and if somebody does contract the disease, I hope that's not the right word. Contract, I believe, maybe.
I think that's
that is the word. Yeah. There you go. By accident came out. If someone does contract COVID-19 in Aleppo, what avenue is there for sort of? Is it just literally only option is isolation at home? You hear that, right?
That's the soundtrack of COVID-19. You're
That's
hearing
the
it a
soundtrack.
lot.
Yeah.
So unlike New York, in Halab, you can't just call up an ambulance and go to the hospital. And if anything, the social divide that COVID-19 is highlighting in New York is also a lot more exasperated and more pronounced in Halab. In Halab, there's very few hospitals that have there's very few hospitals that are still functional.
Right.
Two, there's very few that have ventilators. There's a debate on the exact number of ventilators.
Irrespective of COVID-19, that's separate from that. That just in general, yeah.
Just as an outcome of 4 years of continuous war and siege and just everything that Aleppo has been through. And so today, more than ever, if you have money in Halab, you're more likely to get to one of the 5 or 15 ventilators in a certain place than if you don't. And if you're a refugee or an internally displaced person in this case, then that's even worse. I mean, you've read the headlines. People in IDP camps are just bracing for COVID because they have absolutely no way of...
You know, the moment you said money, it just took me back to my younger years in Beirut at the end of the Civil War, and we're gonna jump deep into that. But that statement, money, and just to get some kind of care, I mean, it's unfortunately so familiar to that part of the world. And when I hear reactions here about that kind of topic, I always sort of, for better or worse, I never sort of put it in its proper place here. I think back to the real sort of dilemma in Beirut, or for that matter, in Aleppo. And we met by accident. We have a common friend who was technically an urban planner, although I don't think he's ever been in that industry per se. I mean, real estate and management, restaurant management. I think it's a curious take on urban planning. You know what it
is one of the branches, quote unquote, of urban planning. We had many real estate finance classes.
Oh, really? Okay, so he's a serious urban planner.
Depends on your definition of the term. He's had to work with the city to get permits.
Absolutely. You're right. Actually, to that point, yes, I'm going to now refer to him as an urban planner. He'll remain nameless for this episode. But he heard me expressing curiosity about other cities, and I was referencing Beirut, cities that have kind of emerged from disaster, not natural disaster, man-made disasters. And I was just sort of bouncing ideas off of his head. When I was talking about Berlin, that's a common comparison. My mind went also to Warsaw post World War II, and I went away. I wasn't sticking at home, so I was thinking of Europe mostly, World War II. Honestly, it didn't occur to me that there's a city next door to Beirut that is about to undertake that kind of dramatic, whatever you want to call it, restoration, reconstruction. Maybe the term itself is complicated. But of course, Aleppo. And it just didn't strike me as the first comparison. And I think that's because all the literature has been mostly on those European examples, with the occasion of maybe Japan is used as an example too, but it's really European heavy. And of course there's Aleppo. And the first person he mentioned was you. And I was lucky because you sent me your thesis. And mind you, I don't usually when somebody sends me a thesis, I'm like, oh, great, here we go. I have to read. But it was such a pleasure to read your thesis.
Really?
Yeah. And with your permission, I'll include the link in the details box, because I sound like a 5-year-old saying this. It's photo heavy. But I enjoy that when it comes to urban planning and restoration. You need to see what you're talking about.
Okay.
I also was really happy to notice that it wasn't just Beirut. It wasn't just Berlin. You include Dresden, you include Kobe in Japan, and I was very curious. And it's sort of an in-depth exploration of Aleppo's story. And there are some things that I know just sort of tangentially. I've sort of come across different articles exploring Aleppo, but I don't know I'm not intimate with the subject. And I also know that you kind of are following, and I hope I say this with I hope I'm not being not overstepping, but you're following your father's passion too in the subject, and that resonates with me. 2 different cities, Beirut, Aleppo, but they're facing a very similar fate. Beirut has kind of been it's almost done to a degree, and maybe it's a very controversial one. We can get into that. But Aleppo, it's still young. It's just the beginning. Now, with that whole sort of prelude to what we're going to get into, I'm just curious, when was the last time you were in Aleppo?
So the last time I was back home was exactly a year
Did you
ago.
just look at your watch?
I looked at the date
Oh,
on my
okay. I thought
was
this could
exactly
have
when
been.
it's my father's watch, and
I see.
it's got the date.
Well, that's
Um,
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, no, I you know how days have no meaning right now.
Of course. Yeah.
It's April 15th. The last time I was in Aleppo was in April of 2019, and had it not been for COVID, I would be in Aleppo right now.
Yeah.
Um,
Over the Easter break.
um, for me, what determines when I go home is weather.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting. Okay. So, yeah.
well, and it's going to speak to a lot of what we're going to talk about, because if you go when it's too hot, then turning on an AC is going to cost you a
Yeah.
fortune. And
Right.
if you go when it's too cold, then heating the house, especially in our case, because our house is gas heated, mazot heated,
Yes.
it's even more expensive than trying to cool the house.
Yeah.
So I always try to pick a middle ground time when it's not too hot and not too cold. And then this year Ramadan starts in May,
Right.
and
Right.
so I figured I wanted to go there and take care of some administrative stuff, and I wanted to go in April. So before everything kind of shut down for Ramadan. And that's usually when I try to go every year.
Right.
I started going back to Aleppo in 2017, in April,
Yes. Hmm.
also, a few months after the battle for Aleppo ended, which was December 2016. And I've been going back ever since.
So, how many years were you away from Aleppo before 2017?
So in 2011, my parents left Aleppo for the summer, and
Okay.
I had left to go back to college.
Hmm.
And we just never went back.
So at least 6 years away from Aleppo altogether.
Yes.
Okay, and the reason I'm curious about the year range is that my mind always goes back to Beirut, and you said that you were supposed to be there in at this time of the year. I'm supposed to be in Beirut right now, and obviously it's impossible at the moment. I mean, the airport is closed, let alone being there is complicated. But I always think of the 15-year marker, because that's the length of the Lebanese civil war. But then I should always put it in context that the civil war, although it dragged on and on and on, the destruction to downtown Beirut was early, and it was the first years. And by sort of maybe the 6 or 7 year mark, downtown Beirut was already sort of damaged, and a lot of it was severely damaged. And then just sort of was nature growing and filling up these abandoned buildings. So that sort of 6 years, it kind of reminds me of Beirut right away, that it was, at least 5, maybe 6, 7 years of intense fighting. And then, of course, the Israeli invasion in 1982. Afterwards, it's just sort of nature growing. So Aleppo kind of has that same length of time in terms of constant damage, and now sort of a pause, or at least the beginning of what seems to be reconstruction. And those 6 years that you were away, what did it feel like on an emotional level, just sort of being away, watching Aleppo on the news? I mean, did it feel like this was sort of, did it feel like you were away from home the whole time and it hurt? Or was it sort of like a distant thing that, in a way, many of us looked at those years and kind of just got, unfortunately, numb and used to it? And I mean, how did you react to those years being away?
Um, well, you touched on a lot of very relevant things, and I'm sure you're going to relate to this. One, I don't watch news on Aleppo because I don't need to.
Yeah.
You just open Facebook and the news is your feed, or your friends
Right.
text you one day that the bombing is heavier than other days, and you look into it. But in my case in particular, I avoid the news because it's depressing. Being away from Aleppo, it to me, it just felt, because it was so sudden how we left, it just felt temporary. It always felt temporary.
Yes, right.
It was always, I'm going to go home.
Yeah.
I just don't know when. I'm just going to go home. And the other thing was just a complete and utter inability to call any other place home. I'm incredibly, incredibly fortunate because I have a U.S. passport. Otherwise, I would never be here. And that's because my father, when he went to college in the U.S., he spent enough time there. He got a passport, and then many years down the line, I what I happened to get. I mean, I won the genetic lottery. There's truly no understating how much of a privilege it is.
I've never heard this before. The genetic lottery. That you're an anchor baby like me.
I mean, well, no, I was born in Syria.
Oh, you were born in Syria. I see. Okay, okay.
I spent the first 18 years of my life in Halab, but my father had a passport when I was born, so I'm a natural-born U.S. citizen.
Right.
Abroad.
Yes.
And it's just, it's genetic lottery because it's this golden ticket that allows you to escape war and then come here. And even though I've been here for so long, I still can't call this home. I'll never say I'm from America. I'm from Syria. I'm Syrian. I happen to have a U.S. passport, but I'm 100% Syrian. New York is as close as it's come because it reminds me of home. But just being away, to come back to your question about what did it feel like being away, was always temporary, and it was always hard to get any news from home whatsoever because I was already getting it from my friends, but also because then the media is just bombarding you with all Aleppo, Oscar-nominated / winning documentaries about the White Helmets, which after that could not watch anything on Aleppo ever again. I just tried watching For Sema 2 days ago, and I couldn't get more than 10 minutes in. It's just impossible. It's home. It's your home. It's as if you were watching television and you see a New York building that blow up. It's surreal.
That's an interesting comparison. So it's something that you know so well and so you're so familiar with, and that you deliberately did not sort of want to see the news for that reason, that it would just sort of add more to the pain, even though you know exactly what's happening, but you don't need to be reminded of it every single minute, every single hour of the day. And I like that you it's very familiar, waiting and hoping maybe next year it would be safe enough. And then, of course, you wait again, and it's 2 years, 3 years, suddenly you're at 6 years, and, some people haven't come back altogether. So that's, the waiting game. And I like that, I spend time in New York. I've been spending almost half of the year now in New York. The city is, probably the most important urban planning experiment. You think about just all these people living in one little part of the world, but it's such an important part of the world. And this is where degrees are produced for urban planning. I know that you got your degree here in New York. Many people are obsessed about the story, and it doesn't resonate with me. I never find that emotional importance, or even my curiosity is limited, even though it's a very important city. But New York doesn't do it for me. And then I think about this little speck on planet Earth, Beirut, and it means everything to me. And I'm always curious about that. Is it that you're reminded of something that was from a more innocent time in your life, or is it just sort of you're prone to certain cities as opposed to others? And I ask this in a very broad way because something in the middle, Berlin, I'm more curious about than New York, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would Berlin resonate more with me than New York? I don't know if any of this resonates with you.
The having more emotional connection to the city that you're from does resonate with me, but New York is definitely, I feel, kind of like coffee. You either love it or you hate it.
Yeah, interesting.
And Berlin, you haven't been tortured by like you have by New York smells that attack you and people who are aggressive with you, and maybe system that can be, or speed that can be too much. So probably Berlin is still a curiosity to you because you haven't
that's interesting.
It. And you have this institutional history in Beirut. You will never feel the same, I think, about a different city because you have the history, the family, the tragedy, your blood is kind of very dramatic. It might be. I really
it touches me. It's a personal thing. It's not. It makes no sense otherwise. And there are cities that have had sort of more dramatic urban planning stories than Beirut, obviously, and yet it resonates more. Yeah, I like the way you said it. So it's family story. It's family sort of. It's almost like a duty to a degree, to care about a city more than another city.
And you're lucky because the city that you're attached to and that your duty is towards is also this incredible melting pot of every culture in the Middle East.
That's
It's so fascinating.
sure, absolutely. And I mean, I'm not going to trash New York here. New York is a melting pot on its own, and it's a very important one. But yeah, I think of the Beirut cosmopolitan story as so much more charming. But no, I'm glad that you finally explained it to me, why that city matters a little more than it should. I'm going to include this in the episode that you wrote 2 Washington Post articles that kind of dance around this subject. And the first one, I think, was in 2017. It's a story about you returning to Aleppo for the first time after 6 years. And the second one is sort of a more politics angle post. I'll include both, but I'm more interested in the first one. This is almost like it's the journey that I remember, but it's the other way around. It's the journey that I remember trying to get into Lebanon during the Civil War. And it's through Syria.
Oh.
So, I mean, in those years, I'm family's from Tripoli. And getting to Tripoli from Beirut was very difficult, if not impossible, during the war years. And we would fly to Damascus. And then take that very long taxi ride all the way around Lebanon to get to the north. Yeah, exactly. This was maybe even could have been longer than 12 hours. I mean, it was just a very long, very, very tiresome journey. And then that's to get to the Lebanese border. And then after that, it's sort of, you make your way. But when I was reading your article, it reminded me of that. All the sort of, every detail is familiar. And for me, it's familiar, and it's bad, because that's something you don't want repeated. Even the little example of the colors of the flags at each checkpoint, that to me is the 1980s altogether. And it's, I don't know, it made me almost identify more with the story, because I could see it myself on the Lebanese side. And you said something at the end of the article which touched me. It's this 10-year-old boy smoking a cigarette, and that it's just been a few years, and that kid only knows war, only knows chaos and violence. And then you are also adamant in trying to preserve a bit of the city's charm and history and heritage. And I know that you're doing this, and your father contributed to this, and we're going to get into that. But I'm asking you from the beginning. This is maybe a bit of a loaded question, but all the sincere efforts, all the positive intention, is there room for hope, given that it's not just that 10-year-old boy, it's a whole generation, and it's now such a torn part of the world, and Aleppo has experienced so much pain? Do you think there's still hope that something as simple as preservation and heritage is possible in the climate we both know in 2020, the way the Middle East is today and the way Syria is? Do you think that there's still room for hope?
I get it a lot. Why are you focusing on buildings when there's people dying? Why is this the time to rebuild heritage when the country is still crumbling? Yeah. But to that I say, one, well, the city's not waiting for the rest of the world to decide that it's time to build. People are rebuilding already. And let's come back to that in a minute, because the way rebuilding is happening right now is dangerous.
Yes.
And two, because Hadabis, Aleppians, like my dad called them, are very, very proud of their old city. It's not only their shared history, it's the world's shared history. And it's something that people would come from all over the world to see. Yeah. We would have Australian tourists come hang out around the citadel of Aleppo and stay in the courtyard home hotels and talk to the children who would run around the citadel. And that gives Aleppians tremendous pride. And they still have that pride, and they hold on to it. And I think that gives them hope that their country is going to come back, and their lives are going to go back to normal. So if you're rebuilding this symbol of hope, then you're giving them back a kind of a reason to keep going and believe that everything is going to be okay after all of this.
That's interesting. So the preservation in itself is a catalyst for positive. that it's not necessarily the other way around, that you should focus more on that 10-year-old kid with the cigarette suffering, that it's actually, if you help preserve something that the city is proud of, it may actually usher in positive change long term.
Yeah, of course, I'm not saying don't help the kid with the cigarette or kids at all.
Yeah.
There are so many amazing NGOs and efforts that are going on right now that help the people, that bring in food, that assist refugees, and of course there's restrictions around all of that. But the hard part right now is the reconstruction in a sustainable manner.
You actually, and it's something you touched in, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the second piece in the Washington Post. That was, I mean, it was more on sanctions, but then within that there was a story about individuals taking action on their own. And I like that you pointed at that that's a risky behavior. Although the sanction stuff is, for better or worse, it's the stuff I know. And I know that from different sort of outlets, and that's always available. But the nitty-gritty of individuals deciding to reframe an arc themselves, or not getting the actual angle correct, and that's a risk. I like the way that you're approaching the subject. And there's a name that you mentioned in the piece. His name escapes me now. Was it Thierry? I forgot his last name.
Thierry Grandin.
Yes, so he's French. There you go. That explains it. Yeah, and I like that. I can see this man kind of wandering around the old souk, and people coming up to him, eager that their neighborhood or that sort of their street or their alley will be next on the list. And you got to see this up front. And that article was just released in 2019. I think it was last May. So it's just a year. It's a young sort of, it's a very recent take on Aleppo. And can you just get into the risk of why individuals rushing to fix early poses a threat to the sort of the, what we were just saying earlier, that kind of the pride and the history of Aleppo?
Okay, so a note on Thierry. Thierry Grandin was my father's business partner and extremely close friend. And together they had an architecture office that used to execute the preservation projects on the old city of Aleppo. So if you had any sort of foreign investment, or even from the Syrian government, funds for the reconstruction of a building or the preservation of the old city of Aleppo, or actually their last big project was redoing all of the sewage and electrical grid of the old city of Aleppo and putting it underground. If you ever walk, you won't see lines in the air. It's all underground. The project of the rehabilitation of the old city of Aleppo, the generic big one, had just ended. And the old city was truly at its height. The citadel perimeter had been almost completely done. The funding that had been put in place by these international organizations was finished because the project was finished, and we'd gotten to kind of a post-restoration era where we were just going to now enjoy all the benefits and the tourists that would come in, and then raise funds from Syrians to continue preservation work. That was Aleppo in 2010, which is what makes this all the more heartbreaking.
Yeah, sure, of course.
The war in Aleppo met in the old city of Aleppo. The city of Aleppo was divided between a government-held area and an opposition-held area, and where they would meet was in the old city, and the old city was a very practical place for this because the streets are very narrow, so you can't go through them with a car, you can't go through them with a big army, and the buildings are all connected, and so you can just blow
wall by wall, right,
through the wall, and it's very easy for troops to go through the old city undetected, so it made it a very good guerrilla warfare location. Unfortunately, it also became a site of common frequent explosions, and it's what caused the destruction of the old city as well. So a lot of the work that was done up until 2010 was destroyed by the war. Thierry Grandin is a walking history book, an encyclopedia about all of the buildings, because of the work that he and my father did over the course of 20 to 30 years on preserving these buildings, the souk, the bimaristans, the citadels. A lot of work was done on the citadel. And so today he's the person, not the only person, but he's the person who represents how reconstruction should be done, because he works on it institutionally. He's getting these big grants from international organizations that are allowed to give him these grants, or the Syrian government, to rebuild large scale exactly according to what it was before.
Oh, so they're going back to where they left off.
They are.
Yeah.
And then there's a big debate about, do you go back to exactly how it was? Do you improve it? Do you change it?
Yes.
Aleppo is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and you have to preserve your heritage, and you have to conserve it, and you have to make sure that if it's destroyed, you're rebuilding it to a certain extent. Otherwise, you lose your status as a World Heritage Site. And the risk right now in Aleppo is not the kind of big institutional work that that Thierry is doing and that is being funded by big donors. The risk is that, as I touch on in my article, individuals are rebuilding haphazardly because they are worried that if they don't, they're going to lose their property.
Right. And that's because there's that sort of, you have to restore to prove that it's yours. Or is that part of it?
So the old city of Aleppo is made up of mostly public-held buildings. In the example of the souk, a lot of the khanat, which is a single stall in the souk, are owned by the Islamic authority in Syria called the Awqaf, which is a ministry. And so if you are a shopkeeper, and most of the stalls in the souk are rented, they're owned by the Awqaf and they're rented by the shopkeepers, and there's a few here and there that are privately owned and are not rented. But if you are a shopkeeper who rented your stall, and you were conducting your whole business out of your stall, and then your stall is completely destroyed, then the Islamic authority of the Awqaf, the Ministry of the Awqaf, gets to void your lease.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So that's why people are prematurely
rebuild, because they just want a structure to be there, because if there is a structure there, then their lease holds, then their claim on the property holds.
That's interesting. So in other words, the intention is good, but it's causing sort of a complication in the restoration process.
Exactly. And of course, there are mechanisms that are supposed to regulate how you rebuild.
Yeah.
This is a post-conflict country. You're supposed to get an approval for exactly how you rebuild or refurbish your stalls. But some people don't, or they do and they don't follow them, or they do and they're not upheld. It's hard to control this stuff in this situation. And so you're seeing a lot of buildings that are almost entirely destroyed, and then the second floor is brand new, shiny white stone. Yeah.
So I'm going to say this, and this is just a sort of a side note, that I'm really happy that you agreed to do this by video, because there are things I'm going to attach to the episode. So while we talk, there will be sort of there'll be layers to the conversation that they're not appearing right now, but they'll be there, including snippets of your thesis when appropriate. I'm asking you these questions because in the second article you said something that it resonated, not from Beirut, from New York. I didn't know this, that the old souk, the old city, is the size of Central Park.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I've been to the old city in Aleppo, but because it's just a maze, an endless maze, it doesn't occur to me that it's huge when you sort of expand it out.
It's really too bad, because our old city, when intact, was basically a little town. Damascus's old city, in comparison, is a lot smaller. There's a few roads that are similar, cobblestone, narrow.
Yeah.
They have their Umayyad mosque. They have, like remnants of a castle. But really nowhere was there a old city that was intact, in Syria at least, within a major city, that was intact to the level of the old city of Aleppo. We even have sections of the old wall that surrounded the old city that were still intact. And we even have neighborhoods that are named after the 7 doors to the old city, gates to the old city. Nera, Bab Nisreen, Bab,
And you point out in the article that it's even, the old city is not even that old when you think about the city's history, that the walls are relatively new, which I like, that they're actually, that's so old, but it's not that old. You should go even deeper.
The oldest, I think, physical trace, let's see, the oldest thing in the city of Aleppo dates back to 3000 BC.
Right. Wow, that's incredible.
So there is evidence, at least, of the continuous inhabitation of the city of Aleppo for 5,000 years. Go to the Met and you see these giant stone carvings of a half bird, half human, half lion
yes.
Deity.
That's
that's what they found. They found these, and I saw them, these giant stones that were about the height of a human that had these beautiful carvings in them of the deities of back in the day. And they discovered this, I think, about a year before the war started, and there was funding in place to make it into a museum. And then the conflict hit Aleppo, and they had to cover it all up with sandbags and preserve it. It's still there. It's intact, as far as I know. It's just another effort derailed, and it's visible proof of how old the city is.
Absolutely. And I hope I got this right, that something about a third of the old city has been severely destroyed, and 2/3 have been to different degrees. I mean, some parts are easily restored, other parts are very difficult, but a lot of the old city is just, it's going to be many years before you can actually restore it to at least a version of what it looked like. And you know what, I always remember that sort of cliche, but it's important to note that it was the longest covered market in the world, and that in itself is sort of astounding. I mean, you think about these things now, it's I don't know, it's our part of the world. It's not, you don't have to go to the Met to experience it. You go to Aleppo and it's an outdoor museum.
You go to the market. It's not even, let's go to the old part of the market. No, let's go to the market.
Yeah.
And it's a market that's been there for millennia, and that's the longest covered market in the world. It's 13 kilometers, which is what, maybe 6-7 miles.
That's incredible. You know, that number is just, because I do remember walking through and getting lost, but yeah, it's important to know this is a lot. Central Park is huge, and that is, you know, right in the middle, in the center of Aleppo.
Yeah, you know, it goes to all the way out to the outer edge of it.
Right. You know, thinking on the Lebanese side, I always thought that it's an interesting sort of flipped comparison. Tripoli and Aleppo, sort of same kind of story, very old city that has a lot of exposed history, and obviously very old within the neighborhood too, that they stand out in their history. And then you have a citadel, you have the Crusader Castle in Tripoli, you have the old souk, you have a lot of the Islamic architecture that's still intact. Go to Beirut, and I mean, Beirut, if you have some memory of what it looked like in the 1970s, you won't recognize downtown today. So this is a completely flipped version. And then other way around, Damascus to me kind of has that sort of Tripoli sort of preservation. It's survived large degree. It hasn't been damaged nearly to the point of Aleppo, it goes without saying. And Tripoli also was not heavily damaged during the Civil War. You go up north, Aleppo has that Beirut sort of comparison. It's destroyed, it needs a lot of work, it'll take a lot of time. In your thesis, you sort of, and I think the majority would say this, that Beirut is not the example to follow. And you kind of get into it, and it's been explored before, that Solidaire is a very controversial way of restoring a city. And you rightly pointed out that the onus should be on the municipality. It shouldn't be a privatized restoration process, that this is not something that a company should do. It should be at least, locals matter. And in the case of Beirut, the local sort of part of it was very controversial. I sense that Aleppo, the knee-jerk reaction is to follow this Solidaire model and make money. And did you get that yourself when you were visiting, or at least in conversations with people that reference the reconstruction? Are they in it for money, and do you see that could be a turn for the worse, that Beirut may end up being the model that's used?
I'm actually really glad you asked about this, because I think the Beirut-Aleppo comparison is going to be very important when it comes to Aleppo's reconstruction. So the general attitude among the people that I've spoken to, so at least within my ability to assess the general attitude is we want to avoid Beirutization.
Yeah, you use that term, Beirutization, right? Yeah.
And I've heard it.
Yeah.
And it's in Arabic, ما بدنا نصير مثل بيروت.
Yeah.
And the aspect of Beirut that I think has been scaring people the most is that the downtown of Beirut that used to be, the old historic beating heart center of it has become this ghost town that nobody can afford.
Yeah.
Yes, it's beautiful, it's shiny, it's got a lot of commerce going on. It might be a big source of revenue for the city, but it doesn't have the life that it used to have. I think there is a fear of that happening in Aleppo. I hope that there's a number of factors in Aleppo that will prevent this. First of all, the attitude of the people wanting it to be restored to what it was. The old city of Aleppo.
You get that sort of from your own experiences that the overwhelming majority is not in favor of Beirut on the local side.
I get that from my discussions with people. I get that there's a lot of Facebook groups because Middle East. There's a lot of Facebook groups where a lot of people from the town contribute and give their thoughts on what should be the outcome of the city of Aleppo. There's actually, if you look at these groups, there is less debate than there would be in an academic setting. In an academic setting, people would say, well, should we really rebuild exactly as it was, or should we explore? Maybe we'd go back a millennia further. Maybe we should take this opportunity to update it.
Yeah.
They're not even having this debate. In these groups, it has to go back to exactly what it was before the war, because we want to restore our jewel, because everybody felt like it was their crown jewel.
So it's 2010. That's the paradigm. That go back to 10 years ago, not necessarily 100 years ago. It's a decade.
It's yes.
Yeah.
But in fact, I would say there was not a huge difference between the old city of Aleppo 100 years ago and 2010.
Okay, that's something I wanted to get into. Yeah. So let's carry on. I want to go back to that point. Yeah.
So yes, going back to Beirut. So one, I think people are very much aware of the danger of becoming like downtown Beirut and are resistant to it. And two, I would hope that the institutions in Aleppo will also prevent it from being privatized and restored by one private entity, because of the way a lot of the buildings are owned by the Awqaf or have to have approval by any restoration or construction project you do in the old city of Aleppo has to be approved by the Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums in Damascus. It's the fact that Aleppo was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the 80s, which my father really pioneered for and fought for, put in place institutions that I think will protect it today from something so large scale as Solidaire in Beirut. I hope.
But that's interesting, because there's two things here I want to get into. The first is it's important to note that you're right. Aleppo, for the most part, the old city, is more or less the way it's been the last 100 years. That's probably, of course, there have been changes, but by and large, I've seen these photos of Aleppo that I sort of explored on my own looking back. A lot of it is intact. Beirut,
very different.
It's very different, almost decade to decade. And it's not that for me, the most charming part of Beirut disappeared 100 years ago. And I'm going to include this in the episode. I just want to, since the screen share button is not working on my side, I'm just going to open it up and make sure that you see what I'm talking about here.
I have a feeling you're going to show me tramways and trolleys and public transit that does not exist today.
I mean, of course, that's part of it. Sure, that's a different sort of tragedy in itself. And I'll include this in the episode, if this is visible on your side.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is a Beirut that disappeared a century ago. And, I mean, for me, if I could wander the streets of old Beirut, which doesn't exist, I would rather go back to that era. And, of course, that doesn't make money. You don't make money off of going back into a romantic version of what you wished your city looked like. But that's 100 years ago. I mean, that's very recent history. Maybe Aleppo is lucky to that point that it already was designated and it didn't change that much up until 2010. So I think there's almost like a strategic advantage for somebody that would want to do what you're doing, that it's not going to be go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. You just made me think of something that I've never voiced that I also thought to entertain. the difference between the old city of Aleppo and the downtown area of Beirut is, I think, the downtown area of Beirut is so much more appealing to make money in because it's a port and because it's on the water. And if
Yeah.
you put tall buildings and apartments along the water side, then that's going to bring in a lot of money. In Aleppo, I do think there's going to be reconstruction that's going to be looking to make money. I don't think it's going to be in the old city, because the old city in and of itself already brought a lot of money into the city in terms of tourism.
Right.
The physical nature of the old city of Aleppo was the appeal of it. It was making money, because when the foreigners came in, they'd spend $150 a night on a hotel room.
Exactly. Yes. So its money was in its sort of in its history. It wasn't its money in sort of its the way Beirut makes its money. It wasn't. There's nothing really historic about Beirut anyway today.
Is there not?
I mean, there is, of course, there's history in Beirut, but nothing like Aleppo. And 100 years ago, there probably would have been more visible history. Beirut has its own citadel, its own castle. Nobody knows where it is. Maybe one wall that's almost been knocked off completely. It's on where the coast used to be. The architectural history of Beirut, a lot of it was bulldozed after the Civil War ended. And that's not just in downtown, that's throughout the city. So even, I mean, going back in time in Beirut is difficult. I think you need someone with you to kind of show you all the time what it once looked like. Aleppo, you don't need that. I mean, the city speaks for itself. But the second point I wanted to get into was the biggest criticism, I think, about Solidaire, aside from the money angle, is that the souk is gone. The old market of Beirut. And I mean, there's enough footage available that you can kind of wander it on your own now, on your laptop or your phone. You can kind of see what once stood. Today, it's just an empty shopping mall. But to me, that doesn't... If I'm a private company and I'm trying to make money, I don't see a motive at restoring a souk. I see a motive in building a shopping mall and making more money, making more rent. So for better or worse, it's at least... that's the privatization story, that you're going to go that route. And it's a disgrace to the city's history. But I get it. It should be a municipal endeavor, and there should be local input. And there was something like that in the early 1990s, but it didn't meet the expectation of what you would want in a reconstructed city. That said, I mean, it requires accountability, and it requires something to turn to. And Beirut was emerging after a civil war, and there was very little accountability, very little government. And it was a very chaotic environment. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of our history. In Aleppo, I'm getting the sense from what you're saying that because there is something like an administration that is still there, that it's not, it is able to still function, and that there is some authority, for better or worse. I'm not asking, not interpreting how that authority is used, but that there is a mechanism. And you mentioned sort of Damascus has a say on what Aleppo does, and there's almost like you can prevent that cutthroat money-making enterprise. That maybe you'll never see something like Solidaire in Aleppo for those reasons. That there is accountability from at least an authority that is still there.
There is. So you touched on something very important, and that I should highlight. Damascus not only has a say, Damascus decides. Syria is a very centralized country.
Yeah.
We don't decide our urban land use policies on a city level. We don't have a city council like you would have in New York that decides what the laws of the old city are. That's decided in Damascus. Syria is very centralized institutionally in terms of urban. We have a ministry of urban. I don't know the exact term in English, but the affairs of the city in Syria are managed by a ministry in Damascus.
So Aleppo's affairs are dictated in Damascus, in that sense. Urban planning is dictated in Damascus.
So any urban planning policy that would cover Aleppo would have to be approved by the ministry in Damascus. When Aleppo became a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a landmark protections law had to go into place to protect the old city of Aleppo, Damascus was the one that had to approve it. And I think this decentralization, even though it should be relaxed over the time. I think the centralization, even though it should be relaxed over time, is what's going to protect the old city short term from giant projects that can threaten its existence. I do think outside the old city of Aleppo, there will probably be these kind of profit-driven big infrastructure projects. I'm already seeing, friends who work on creating giant shopping centers in certain parts of the city that have been destroyed.
That's sort of outside of, that's not in the old city. Yeah, right.
That's outside the 350 hectare radius of the old city. And another thing is the old city it's very high profile. It's a point of pride for the entire country. And because it is so high profile, and because it's been in the news, and because the old city had the stature that it had, it's actually very hard to do work there. So because you have to jump through a lot of hoops, you have to get the director of antiquities to agree to it. You have to get this. There's also a local authority, a directorate of the old city in the city that has to approve it. The Awqaf, if it's an Awqaf held building, has to also approve it. So I think there's enough institutional barriers that will prevent a large-scale destructive project.
That's interesting. So it's really an accident that is already in place.
That's
so that
already
kind of
in place.
Right.
Risk is the smaller projects, like I mentioned, that take place by the shopkeeper who's trying to keep his property, by the restaurant owner who wants to maybe add another floor when he rebuilds his restaurant, by the person who's buying up all this real estate in the old city for cheap because it's rubble right now, and who intends to down the line do something different with it. That is a risk, and that is, if it's not mitigated, going to long-term potentially harm the city by harming several patches everywhere, as opposed to like Solidaire raising it and harming it all at once. If you see my gist.
It's always important because Beirut, that downtown was not so charming before the war broke out. It had already kind of lost a lot of its historic charm, and its preservation had been was reckless. And people, Martyrs Square, the heart of the city, was already in derelict shape before the war broke out. No excuse to reach where it is today, but that other parts of the city are as important, at least to me, when it comes to the wider city's story. So I'm sure, Aleppo has its. There's endless charm in the city, and I hope it's not just the old city that survives, and the rest of the city is kind of a Solidaire-like experiment.
I hope so as well. I'm talking a lot to you about the old city, which is 350 hectares, but it's only 10% of the surface area, 15% of the surface area of Aleppo.
Yes.
And a lot of Aleppo was destroyed. Eastern Aleppo, I would say, which covers about 60 to 75% of the area of Aleppo, has been heavily, severely damaged. And that is where you're going to see, I think, Solidaire-like projects. And
where it's just simply easier to experiment, unfortunately, in those settings. Yeah.
When there's nothing there, it's easy to build a big project.
It also sort of ties into the sad the bigger sort of tragedy here, that this is not a short-lived conflict, that it has been dragging on and on and on. And I think 15-year marker is horrible for Lebanon, and the consequences are still felt. I want to wrap it up with your father's career, and I've done some research on my own. Thankfully, there's a Wikipedia page, but there's sort of articles that link to it, and I kind of jumped in. And I think a lot of them they kind of link back to you. There's a lot of emotion in the story, and I know that beyond your own sort of personal work, that I get the obvious impression that he was very dedicated to saving the old city, or at least preventing dramatic change that would be irreversible. And most of the articles go back to the 1970s, that there's a risk of dramatic change on the horizon. These boulevards, these sort of widening corridors that are kind of, unfortunately, part of the East Berlin story. You see that sort of these wide corridors and sort of rows and rows of fairly hideous architecture, and that he kind of was trying to keep that very, very, very important charm to Aleppo, and he succeeded to a point. He actually he did it. The World Heritage the UNESCO Heritage listing is, I think, his contribution, and I find a lot of charm in that story, that one man can kind of do it. Can just from your own interactions and your own what you remember of that sort of passion, what drove him to want to save the old city? Why was it important to him? I mean, I always think these are very personal stories, and there's something inside the person, and I always like to explore that personal component. What was it about? What was it inside him that made him really want to preserve its beauty?
You're gonna like this story. So my father was born in 1940.
Wow.
He was also a walking history book. He was born in 1940 in the old city of Aleppo, just a few blocks from the citadel. He, I think until his mid-teens, he grew up walking to his school, which was across the street from the citadel, every day through these winding corridors.
So his childhood was exploring the old city.
His childhood was the old city.
Yeah.
He was born. He grew up in a courtyard home.
Yes.
With the courtyard in the middle and the fountain and the rooms around the
Yeah.
courtyard, windows all facing inwards, in the family home, to a family that's much similar to yours, very political, very civic oriented, just people who loved helping people.
Yeah.
And then the other neighborhoods of Aleppo started developing around the old city.
Right. So he grew up seeing that change outside of the old city.
Well, and he ended up moving to those neighborhoods outside the old city because
I
with
see.
time, families who could move out of the old city did. They moved to the newer parts of town that had taller buildings
Yeah.
rather than two-floor homes, windows to the outside, more modern parts of the city.
Yes.
What was left in the old city after this expansion was middle to low income families. This is actually really important. The people who lived in the old city of Aleppo before 2010 were not rich. They were darawish. They were middle to low income families.
Your thesis actually gets into that subject, which I found really interesting. That, the older, the aristocrats, whatever you want to call them, had already packed up.
Had packed up and left.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then my father went to college in the U.S. and he ended up staying there for a number of years. He married his first wife. He had my sister. And he was working in an architectural office, and I think at some point he thought he was going to stay there. And he would come back to Aleppo to visit his parents and his family. And then I think one year he came back and he realized that there was this big master plan.
So so it kind of caught him off guard to a degree that he does. I mean, that was, I forget the name of the commission now. Maybe you could remind me.
It was a mix. There was two big plans, one by André Gouton, of
Yes.
course, a French person, because we were a French mandate.
Yes, yes.
And then a Ben Shoya, who was a Japanese plan, which the city...
I love that these are outside influences on a city's history. You know, that it's like, why shop abroad? You don't need this.
Planning as a practice was not that developed or respected in
Yes.
general.
Yeah.
And it was really the West that, especially after World War II, when they had to rebuild a lot of the cities that were damaged, it was really the West that pioneered it. And so it wasn't that they came into the city and told us what to do. The city of Aleppo commissioned these
Yes.
people to come do a master plan for them to spark economic growth. At the end of the day, that was their goal. How do we maximize the economic growth of the city of Aleppo? And they had said, well, you have this very dense part of the city in the center.
Get rid of it.
No, tear these roads, arterial roads through it to allow cars to take goods and services throughout the city more efficiently. Does that encourage economic growth? Potentially, but then you're destroying the fabric of the old city.
You're destroying why people would want to be there to begin with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a debate that's always going on in urban planning and urban development. What do you keep? What do you sacrifice? And for my father, he just couldn't bear the idea of so much destruction happening to the neighborhood where he grew up, the 5,000-year-old city. And he decided to move back, and he ended up dedicating the subsequent 30 years of his life more to its preservation. He fought.
So he moved back for that purpose.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
I'm sure there was family reasons as well, but primarily he wanted to save his old city, and he got on the commission, the mayor's commission, and convinced them to abandon the plan, and talk to the actors who went to UNESCO and helped classify the city as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. He had a big role in all of it, and very importantly, he had contacts with the German Development Agency, back then called the GTZ, now it's called the GIZ, who were able to get the German government to give Syria a debt forgiveness program for every dollar that they would spend on the old city. So the agreement was that every dollar the Syrian government would give to the reconstruction or preservation of the old city of Aleppo would be $2 written off their debt to the German government, because Syria owed a debt to the German government.
Wow.
And so that agreement, that project that he helped broker through his friends who are still good friends of mine who used to live in the old city of Aleppo and just loved researching it, that agreement that he brokered ended up securing about $30 million for the preservation of the old city of Aleppo for the subsequent.
So he found a financial motive to restore.
Yes, and the motive was for the Syrian government is that it would forgive their debt.
Yeah.
Then it would also funnel the money into the preservation of the old city.
Can I ask you though, I'm curious, how does somebody establish that transnational network alliance to save an old city? How did he do that?
He was a very social person.
That's a very diplomatic answer. Thank you.
He was very social. He always had a smile on his face. He was lighthearted, and then also there's my mother. I mean, by the way, earlier you said that the cities of Aleppo need rebuilding. Homs is another city that is forever to be touched by this, and my mother is from Homs, so she would have my head if she knew that I talked about Halab without talking about Homs.
We'll do another episode later.
Another episode.
She won't know about this one.
But him and my mother would often, host these dinners, these parties, talk to people, convince them to get in on it. So,
but that's I like that he's sort of thinking out of the box, because he saw that this could happen and it probably would have happened, and he sort of found a way to at least alleviate the financial concerns, or at least think of something that would bring a group on board to the project. I mean, irrespective of the damage the last decade, I'm glad your father was able to see a lot of your work come to fruition, and he kind of raised you to follow his footsteps, and I think he'd be very proud of what you're doing. And I really enjoy talking to anyone who's passionate about a city's history. So I hope we can do another episode that would alleviate your mom's concerns about hummus. I honestly, as somebody I used to wander around Syria recklessly. I used to hitchhike. I would take the very, very, very...
Syria.
Sorry?
I can't believe you hitchhiked in Syria.
2004, a friend of mine, we just went. We made our way from Damascus to Aleppo, but the long way, so we would stop every sort of place possible. The journey started in Ma'lula and then kind of zigzagged our way north. So Hummus was on the trip, Hama, and then we made it to Aleppo. He had to leave, I think, early on, and I stayed almost a month. I just sort of, I was hanging out in Aleppo, in a hostel in the old city. And, this is coming from Beirut and from Lebanon, and really astonished at how much history was available. And always kind of thinking of that, it's like, why is there so much more care and attention to detail here as opposed to Beirut? Or did not know back then, this is just a naive sort of wanderer, did not know that I would later talk to the daughter of the man who made that dream possible. So it's an honor for me to actually kind of connect with someone who made that journey, I think, all the more charming and beautiful. And I hope one day to actually go back to Syria and see Aleppo myself.
I'm really glad you got to see Halab when you did. I'm actually, whenever I meet somebody who's been to Aleppo before the war, I'm very excited that they've seen it kind of at its height, and I, with all my heart, tell them that someday I hope they see it the way it was again. And in my heart, I have to believe that that's true, because otherwise, what am I doing? in the last 5 years of my dad's work, I think that was like when the old city was really reaching its peak, and the the projects were coming to an end. There was excavations happening in the Citadel. The cafes were opening across the street from the Citadel, and
Yeah.
suddenly it became popular to hang out there. When you're young, you would just go have an ergile, a shisha in front of the Citadel, and it was really starting to be brimming. And then the war happened and destroyed a lot of it. And the last time I went back to Aleppo with my father, which happened to be about 2 months before he died, I was pleading him, I was fighting him to move back and set up an office again and work on rebuilding it. And I was like, if not you, then who? You know?
Well, that answer, I think, I'm glad you've decided. I think, and I sense that you was very clear to you to make that choice.
Well, he gave me a way out.
You're not my daughter.
Yeah. He didn't want to do it. To him, he said to me, I've already seen my dream come true.
Yeah.
And to him, having watched that process happen was enough to not need to go further. And he gave me a way out. So when he died, to me, it was very clear that my father had explicitly said to me that he didn't want to do it, that we shouldn't do it, that it was too early. What if things blow up again and everything gets destroyed again? Go enjoy your life and live it the best you can. And yet, it's 2.5 years after he died, and it's still all I really care about.
Absolutely.
And all I want to do.
Yeah.
And then I go home and I see things like this project that Thierry worked on with the help of a big international foundation and support of the Syrian government. And I'll send you a photo of this.
Please do.
But
Yes.
a photo of a 100-meter stretch of the souk, 100 meters out of a 13-kilometer souk,
Yeah.
100-meter stretch that was entirely redone and rebuilt for $400,000.
This is the market that you referenced in the piece. The food. I think it was the meat and.
So it was a meat market.
Yes.
And when you go through the souk, you've got sections. First you have the jewelry, the gold, the silver,
Right.
the spices, the scarves,
Yes.
and in the end it's the meat market.
Right.
But I think they had picked this section of the souk because it was somehow less damaged or easier strategically to fix. And a few months after I left Aleppo the last time, he sent me this photo of the completed project, and it is incredible. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I look at that and I see the price tag on it, and I think this can be done. If you can do this on the whole city. The obstacle is willingness to do it, availability of resources, and the more I look at this photo, the more I want to be somebody who's a facilitator between a donor and somebody who's going to execute a project like this. Unfortunately, right now, the souk is still the property of the Syrian government, so I can't take American money and use it to rebuild the souk, but there's a lot of private courtyard homes.
Yes.
There's a lot of mosques, and mosques is a question mark still. Churches that can be rebuilt. Private property that can be then turned around and made into civic centers, trainings. You can train a stonemason so that then they can go get a job rebuilding something somewhere.
Right.
There's a lot that I can still do within the limits of the sanctions. And hey, who knows? Maybe in a year, everything will blow up in my face and I will not have anything to do with the foundation. But for now, I owe it to myself to at least try, right?
I without having met you, just this brief conversation, I get the feeling that there's a creative spirit within you too, and that you will probably find a way forward and make your own dream come true. I'd like to see that dream come true. I'm glad your father lived long enough to see his dream come true, and I think any father would say that if they saw their child following their footsteps, I think they'd offer them the way out, and I think at the same time,
Yeah.
hope that they don't. And it's everything you just said resonated with me. I mean, we're both American citizens. We're both in New York, and we're both thinking about home. And you said it. I mean, Aleppo is your home, Beirut is mine, and we have parents that gave us a way out, American
You need
nationality.
politics?
So sorry.
You don't want to go into Lebanese politics?
This is my version of Lebanese politics. So whatever you want to call this, yeah. But that sort of, we have a way to stay in the States for the rest of our lives without hassle. Yet we're kind of drawn to going back to at least what we consider home, and what both of us, I mean, our respective fathers, spent their lives fighting for. So on that note, I want to thank you for taking this afternoon with me, taking an hour and a half of your time with me. All the visuals will be up on the podcast, so you'll see them on your end as well once it comes out. And I hope we can continue this conversation later, and I hope you keep me updated with all that's happening with your NGO and your work on Aleppo. So,
Of course.
thank you, Jwanah.
Thank you, Ronnie. You have a good day, and maybe someday we'll meet in real life.
Once this pandemic passes, I'd love to.
Inshallah.